If you appreciate factual Cold War history, consider subscribing and leaving a like. And if you have questions about the material, feel free to ask in the comments. February 21st, 1994, Fairfax County, Virginia. At 10 o'clock in the morning, surveillance units from the FBI's Washington field office watched a silver 1985 Jaguar XJ6 reverse from the driveway of Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer with full access to Soviet counterintelligence penetrations, clandestine reporting circuits, and restricted operational cables from Moscow Station. In the previous 9 years, CIA internal reviews documented one of the most severe intelligence collapses of the late Cold War period. 27 human assets compromised, several executed, and multiple operational channels rendered unusable. Directorate of Operations budget lines showed increased spending but declining output, while KGB archival material later confirmed unusually precise targeting. Analysts in the Office of Security noticed patterns that could not be explained by technical interception, financial irregularities, identical timing of losses, and asset disappearances tied to compartments known by only a few. When agents closed in on Ames's vehicle, they were confronting not a suspect, but the endpoint of one of the most damaging insider breaches in U.S. intelligence history. Aldrich Ames entered the Central Intelligence Agency in June of 1962. His personnel jacket recorded his assignment to the Directorate of Operations after completing the Career Trainee Program at Langley, Virginia. The CIA, still evolving after early Cold War failures, including the Bay of Pigs disaster, emphasized human intelligence development targeting the Soviet Union. New officers were expected to provide stability following internal reforms designed to prevent future operational catastrophes. The agency's institutional memory carried the weight of previous failures, and leadership demanded rigorous standards for new recruits entering the clandestine service. The reality, however, proved more complicated than the idealized recruitment vision. Performance reports on Ames showed mixed evaluations and persistent concerns about discipline throughout his early career. The CIA Inspector General's review from 1994 would later note that Ames exhibited inconsistent work habits from early in his career, raising questions that were documented but never fully investigated. Supervisors noted problems with punctuality, attention to detail, and adherence to established procedures. Yet despite these warning signs appearing repeatedly in his personnel file, Ames steadily advanced through the agency's ranks, accumulating increasingly sensitive assignments and broader access to compartmented operations. The CIA's operational infrastructure in this era relied heavily on proven Cold War tradecraft developed through 2 decades of espionage operations. Officers used burst transmitters for rapid, encrypted communications, as described in declassified CIA technical documentation from the period. Chalk-mark signals facilitated covert agent meetings in hostile surveillance environments. Manual cipher pads provided field encryption for communications that couldn't be transmitted electronically. Dead drops, brush passes, and elaborate surveillance detection routes formed the foundation of agent handling in denied areas. These systems had been refined over decades of espionage operations against the Soviet bloc, tested under pressure, and continuously improved based on operational experience and counterintelligence analysis. Senior officers like Edward J. Curran and Burton Gerber oversaw networks of assets throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself. These veteran case officers had spent careers developing sources, managing operations, and navigating the complex bureaucracy of CIA headquarters. They represented the institutional expertise that made the Directorate of Operations effective against Soviet intelligence targets. Their experience shaped operational doctrine and influenced how younger officers like Ames learned the craft of espionage. Ames's assignments placed him at the center of Soviet operations within the CIA's organizational structure. He handled cases involving defectors who had provided valuable intelligence about Soviet military capabilities and intelligence operations. He managed communications with assets behind the Iron Curtain, coordinating secure contact schedules and emergency protocols. He processed intelligence from some of the CIA's most valuable sources inside the USSR's military and scientific establishments, reading their reports and preparing analytical summaries for senior policymakers. Each assignment deepened his access to compartmented information, creating what counterintelligence specialists would later recognize as a dangerous concentration of knowledge. This access represented the most sensitive categories of U.S. intelligence collection against the Soviet Union. Ames knew the identities of CIA assets operating in Moscow, their reporting methods and communication schedules, their handlers and support networks, and the specific intelligence they provided to the United States government. He understood which operations were most productive, which assets were most vulnerable, and which intelligence gaps the CIA was attempting to fill. This comprehensive knowledge, accumulated over nearly 2 decades, made him extraordinarily valuable to the agency's mission. By 1980, Ames had accumulated precisely the type of access the KGB had tried and failed to penetrate for decades through technical means and surveillance operations. He represented a strategic intelligence vulnerability of extraordinary magnitude. It was also unknown to CIA leadership, who trusted him based on years of service, a catastrophic weakness waiting to be exploited by Soviet intelligence services seeking exactly this kind of comprehensive penetration. The global intelligence environment entering the 1980s showed significant changes on both sides of the Iron Curtain as the Cold War entered what would prove to be its final decade. In 1981, declassified CIA cables from Moscow Station indicated intensified Soviet surveillance saturation throughout the capital, with counterintelligence resources deployed at levels that exceeded even the most intensive periods of earlier decades. The KGB's Line KR counterintelligence staffing exceeded 1,200 officers dedicated specifically to identifying and neutralizing Western intelligence operations inside the Soviet Union. These officers operated sophisticated surveillance networks, technical monitoring systems, and informant networks designed to detect any contact between Soviet citizens and Western intelligence officers. The CIA believed advanced tradecraft could offset KGB monitoring capabilities through superior operational security and sophisticated detection methods. Agency doctrine emphasized surveillance detection routes that could identify hostile observation, secure communication protocols that minimized exposure time, and multiple backup systems for agent contact that provided redundancy if primary methods were compromised. These measures had worked reasonably well through the 1970s, allowing the CIA to maintain productive networks inside the Soviet Union despite intensive KGB surveillance. Operations officers underwent extensive training in surveillance detection, learning to identify the subtle indicators of hostile observation during operational acts. Soviet files released after 1991 indicate a different picture than what CIA analysts understood during the period. KGB counterintelligence efficiency doubled between 1981 and 1985, measured by successful detection and neutralization of Western intelligence operations. This improvement stemmed not from technical breakthroughs in surveillance equipment, but from systematic enhancements in methodology and resource allocation. The KGB's Second Chief Directorate refined its approach to surveilling suspected foreign intelligence officers, developing more sophisticated patterns of observation that were harder to detect. They deployed fixed-point photography along Moscow's Garden Ring, creating permanent observation posts that could document patterns of movement over extended periods. They coordinated multi-team surveillance operations with unprecedented precision, using radio communications and pre-positioned vehicles to maintain continuous coverage of suspected intelligence officers. CIA Director William Casey and KGB Chairman Viktor Chebrikov presided over their respective agencies during this period of escalating intelligence competition between the superpowers. Casey pushed aggressively for expanded human intelligence operations inside the USSR, believing that technical collection alone could not provide the strategic warning necessary for national security. This emphasis was reflected in budget increases and expanded station staffing throughout Soviet bloc countries. Chebrikov directed substantial resources toward neutralizing Western penetrations, viewing counterintelligence as the KGB's highest priority in an era when Soviet military and political secrets faced unprecedented Western collection efforts. The intelligence competition operated across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Technical collection through satellites and signals intelligence provided vast amounts of data about Soviet military capabilities, but human intelligence remained essential for understanding intentions, political dynamics, and technological developments that couldn't be observed from space. Both sides invested heavily in protecting their secrets while attempting to penetrate the other's defenses. The stakes were understood to be existential. Accurate intelligence could prevent miscalculation in a crisis, while intelligence failures could lead to catastrophic consequences. The Senate Intelligence Committee's 1994 review would later conclude that operational declines during this period could not be explained by Soviet surveillance capabilities alone, based on technical assessments of KGB capabilities. The technology available to the KGB, while sophisticated and improving, did not account for the precision with which they began targeting specific CIA assets in 1985. Something beyond improved surveillance methodology was providing the Soviets with detailed intelligence about American operations, allowing them to neutralize assets with unusual speed and accuracy. Unknown to U.S. leadership conducting strategic assessments and planning future operations, the decisive breach would originate not in Moscow, where the KGB had home field advantage, but in Langley, where the CIA believed its security protocols protected against insider threats. April of 1985 marked a turning point in the Cold War intelligence struggle, though it would take nearly a decade for the full implications to become clear to investigators. Bank records from that month show Ames depositing over $50,000 into his personal account at a financial institution in the Washington metropolitan area. This sum far exceeded his government salary, which remained under $70,000 annually even after nearly 2 decades of federal service. The deposit represented approximately 75% of his annual gross income, appearing suddenly without apparent explanation or legitimate source. CIA security protocols theoretically protected against such anomalies through a layered system of monitoring and review. Lifestyle reviews examined whether officers lived within their documented means, looking for indicators of unexplained wealth or financial stress that might make them vulnerable to recruitment. Periodic financial audits were designed to detect officers living beyond their means, checking bank records and major purchases against known income sources. This represented one of the classic indicators of potential espionage identified through decades of counterintelligence experience. The system had worked in previous cases, successfully identifying officers with unexplained income or suspicious foreign contacts within months of their first compromise, allowing rapid investigation and arrest. The reality exposed a critical gap in the CIA's internal security architecture that would prove catastrophic. Financial audits were infrequent due to resource limitations and competing priorities, conducted manually without automated flagging systems, and rarely applied with rigor to senior officers who had established long careers without incident or previous security concerns. Ames fell into precisely this category, a veteran officer with decades of service and broad access, someone whose lifestyle might not trigger immediate scrutiny even if anomalies appeared in routine checks. The organizational culture assumed that long-serving officers had proven their loyalty and reliability through years of faithful service. The Office of Security Personnel responsible for monitoring CIA employees faced significant constraints in their mission. They had limited resources to investigate the thousands of CIA officers and contractors requiring oversight. They faced an organizational culture that sometimes viewed aggressive internal investigations as disruptive to operations and harmful to morale. Senior officers, particularly those in the Directorate of Operations where Ames served, often enjoyed considerable autonomy and minimal oversight of their personal finances. The assumption prevailed that operational security and compartmentation provided adequate protection against insider threats. Rosario Ames, Aldrich's wife, whom he had married during this period, provided partial cover for the sudden influx of wealth that might otherwise have triggered investigation. She came from a Colombian family with business interests in South America, and Ames attributed some of his unexplained income to family sources in Colombia. This explanation, while thin and unsupported by documentation, proved sufficient to forestall immediate investigation by security officers who had many other cases competing for attention. The CIA's manual financial review systems lacked the automated anomaly detection that modern banking systems would later employ, making it easier for statistical outliers to escape notice. Ames's financial situation, documented in court records and CIA personnel files reviewed during the post-arrest investigation, showed increased strain during this period related to divorce proceedings and lifestyle expenses. KGB archival files released after 1991 confirm April of 1985 as the date of Ames's first paid contact with Soviet intelligence officers in Washington. The timing was not coincidental from the KGB's perspective. Soviet intelligence had long sought penetration of the CIA's Soviet Operations Division, recognizing it as the highest value target in the American intelligence community. The KGB, always alert for vulnerable American intelligence officers who might be recruited, recognized the opportunity that Ames's financial pressures presented. That same month, several top-tier CIA assets inside Moscow abruptly vanished from contact with their handlers, beginning a pattern of losses that would devastate American intelligence operations. The period from July through December of 1985 witnessed one of the most severe intelligence catastrophes the CIA had ever faced, destroying networks that had taken years to develop. In Moscow, at least 10 high-value informants were arrested within months of each other in a pattern that defied normal counterintelligence probability. These were not peripheral sources providing marginal intelligence, but critical assets representing years of cultivation and operational investment. Soviet military officers with access to strategic planning, KGB personnel who understood Soviet intelligence operations, and scientific establishment insiders who provided technological intelligence had all provided some of the CIA's most valuable reporting about USSR capabilities and intentions. The arrest of Valery Martinov exemplified the sudden collapse of operations that had previously appeared secure. Martinov, a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover in Washington at the Soviet embassy, had provided secure reporting to the CIA for 23 months without apparent security compromise. His intelligence included detailed information about KGB operations in the United States, revealing Soviet intelligence priorities and methods. He reported on Soviet counterintelligence methods used to detect American espionage, providing insight that helped protect other operations. He described internal KGB politics and personnel dynamics that helped CIA analysts understand Soviet intelligence decision-making. The information proved invaluable for protecting CIA operations and understanding Soviet intelligence priorities during a critical period of Cold War competition. Martinov's arrest followed a pattern that would repeat with disturbing regularity throughout late 1985 and into 1986. Assets with no apparent security violations simply disappeared from contact with their CIA handlers. They used communication systems that showed no signs of technical compromise or hostile interception. They had followed operational security procedures meticulously, avoiding patterns and maintaining compartmentation. Within weeks of losing contact, Soviet state media would announce espionage arrests, though they rarely provided details about the individuals involved or how they had been identified by counterintelligence services. CIA analysts initially attributed the losses to surveillance breakthroughs or compromised communication systems following standard counterintelligence reasoning. This explanation aligned with historical patterns observed in previous cases of operational compromise. The KGB had demonstrated sophisticated technical capabilities before, successfully detecting CIA communications and identifying American intelligence officers through patient surveillance. The CIA assumed that Soviet counterintelligence might have achieved new advances in detecting covert communications or identifying case officers through improved technical means. Engineers examined communication systems for evidence of penetration or signal compromise. Soviet archives released after 1991 revealed a simpler reality that contradicted the CIA's technical compromise theory. Ames had provided Martinov's identity directly to the KGB during his initial meetings with Soviet intelligence officers in April of 1985. The KGB Directorate K teams, responsible for counterintelligence operations inside the Soviet Union, received detailed information through this human source: asset names and true identities, their intelligence value and access to Soviet secrets, their communication methods and meeting schedules, and their CIA handlers and support networks. This comprehensive betrayal eliminated any need for sophisticated technical collection or patient surveillance operations. CIA technical teams examined the encrypted communication systems used for Moscow station operations with increasing urgency as losses mounted, as referenced in declassified technical assessments from the period. Engineers found no evidence of technical breach in any system. The encryption algorithms remained secure against known Soviet cryptanalytic capabilities. The burst transmission protocols functioned correctly without detectable interception. Signal analysis showed no signs of Soviet monitoring or decryption attempts. The KGB, meanwhile, employed standard interrogation protocols during their processing of arrested assets, as described in declassified Soviet documentation. Nothing suggested advanced technical capabilities that could explain the comprehensive nature of the compromises. CIA loss reports compiled through late 1985 listed 10 confirmed compromises within a 6-month window, representing years of operational investment. Statistical analysis of the pattern revealed several troubling characteristics that pointed away from normal counterintelligence explanations. The timing showed unusual clustering, with arrests occurring in rapid succession rather than the more gradual pattern expected from surveillance-based detection. The assets compromised represented diverse operational channels using different communication methods. They maintained varying levels of access to Soviet secrets across different organizations. Yet all were neutralized within months, despite these differences. The identical timing patterns increasingly indicated a single-source breach inside the CIA itself rather than any external technical compromise. Between 1986 and 1991, Ames received over $2.5 million from the KGB in what became one of the most lucrative espionage arrangements ever uncovered in American intelligence history. This sum dwarfed the payments made to previous American spies, even accounting for inflation and the strategic value of their intelligence. It reflected both the extraordinary value of Ames's access to the CIA's most sensitive operations and the KGB's recognition that they had achieved a penetration of unprecedented strategic significance. Soviet intelligence understood they had compromised the officer responsible for managing counterintelligence against their operations, providing visibility into virtually every CIA operation targeting the USSR. Counterintelligence theory developed over decades suggested that espionage indicators would include wire transfers to foreign accounts that could be traced through international banking systems. Unusual financial transactions would create paper trails that investigators could follow. Patterns could be traced through banking systems with cooperation from financial institutions. The KGB's tradecraft, refined over decades of running agents inside Western governments, deliberately avoided such obvious vulnerabilities that had compromised previous espionage networks. Payments were delivered in cash via Line X officers operating from the Soviet embassy in Washington. These technology transfer officers, ostensibly focused on acquiring Western technology for Soviet industry, had legitimate reasons to meet with Americans in the course of their ostensible diplomatic duties. This provided operational cover for the financial transfers that would have appeared suspicious if conducted through normal banking channels. FBI counterintelligence officer Leslie Weiser would later analyze the payment structure during the investigation that led to Ames's arrest. The amounts varied based on the specific intelligence provided in each delivery, with larger payments corresponding to particularly valuable information. Complete lists of CIA assets operating inside the Soviet Union commanded premium payments. Operational cables from Moscow Station, revealing CIA intelligence collection priorities, received substantial compensation. Details about technical collection programs that the Soviets needed to defend against were highly valued. The KGB structured payments strategically to reward continuing access while avoiding patterns that might trigger financial monitoring systems or create statistical anomalies that security investigators could detect. Rosario Ames participated directly in the espionage operation, providing additional cover for the unexplained wealth that now flowed into the family's finances. The couple purchased a house in Arlington, Virginia, for over $500,000 in cash, a transaction that should have triggered immediate security reviews but somehow passed unnoticed by CIA oversight mechanisms. They drove expensive imported cars far beyond what government employees typically owned. They took international vacations to luxury destinations. They accumulated luxury goods and maintained a lifestyle far beyond what a CIA officer's salary could support, even with careful financial management. The FBI's 1994 affidavit, prepared to support Ames's arrest warrant, would detail a comprehensive analysis of unexplained assets and credit expenditures spanning nearly a decade. Bank records showed deposits, wire transfers, and cash transactions totaling millions of dollars over an 8-year period without legitimate explanation. Credit card statements revealed spending patterns completely inconsistent with government employment income levels. The financial evidence alone built an overwhelming case, demonstrating that Ames had received substantial payments from an external source. Yet during the years when Ames was most active as a Soviet agent, these obvious anomalies went completely undetected by security systems designed specifically to identify such patterns. The most troubling aspect of Ames's continued operation was his repeated success in passing polygraph examinations administered by experienced CIA polygraph operators. The CIA administered multiple polygraph tests during the late 1980s, following standard procedure for officers with high-level access to sensitive, compartmented information about ongoing operations. Ames passed these examinations despite actively conducting espionage throughout the period, receiving payments from Soviet intelligence, and maintaining clandestine contact with KGB handlers. This exposed fundamental limitations in the polygraph as a security tool and raised questions about over-reliance on technical methods rather than traditional investigative techniques. Despite unexplained wealth that was visible to colleagues, friends, and neighbors who observed his lifestyle, Ames continued operating without detection by the CIA's internal security apparatus. By 1987, Directorate of Operations cables from CIA headquarters at Langley cited severe degradation in Soviet intelligence networks across multiple operational channels. The CIA's ability to collect human intelligence inside the USSR had collapsed to levels not seen since the early Cold War period of the 1950s. Assets carefully developed over years through patient cultivation had been systematically compromised. Communication systems refined through decades of operational experience had been rendered ineffective by Soviet counterintelligence. Operational channels that had provided consistent, reliable intelligence for years all became useless within months of the initial compromises. The scale of the collapse began to suggest something more systematic than normal operational losses. The initial explanation favored by CIA leadership focused on technical compromise of communications platforms as the most likely explanation for the losses. CIA engineers and cryptographers conducted exhaustive reviews of the encrypted circuit systems used for classified communications with Moscow Station, as described in declassified technical reviews from the investigation. They examined burst transmitters used for rapid communications that minimized exposure time. They analyzed cipher protocols to determine if Soviet cryptanalysts had achieved breakthroughs. They reviewed signal security procedures to identify potential interception points. The technical investigation employed some of the CIA's most sophisticated analytical capabilities and consumed thousands of hours of engineering time. They found no evidence whatsoever of Soviet capability to intercept or decrypt CIA communications. Engineers independently confirmed that the encrypted circuits maintained their full security integrity throughout the period of compromises. The encryption algorithms remained mathematically unbroken by any known cryptanalytic technique. Transmission security showed no vulnerabilities that would allow interception without detection. Signal analysis detected no signs of Soviet interception, monitoring, or attempted decryption of communications. The KGB possessed sophisticated signals intelligence capabilities developed over decades of technical investment. But declassified Soviet technical documentation reviewed after the Cold War showed no documented capability to break CIA encrypted communications during this period. The technical explanation, while initially plausible, could not be sustained in the face of overwhelming evidence. This technical conclusion forced intelligence analysts toward a troubling alternative hypothesis that had profound implications. If the communications systems remained secure against technical attack, then the compromises had to originate from human sources with direct access to the intelligence being transmitted through those secure channels. The pattern indicated insider knowledge of a comprehensive nature. Someone who knew not only that assets existed, but their specific identities, precise locations, communication schedules, and the exact intelligence they provided to the United States government. The precision of Soviet targeting suggested access to operational files rather than surveillance-based detection. A 1990 classified memo, later included in congressional reviews of the Ames case, concluded that the operational pattern was consistent with insider compromise rather than technical breach based on multiple indicators. The assessment noted several characteristics that pointed toward human betrayal. Simultaneous compromises occurred across different operational channels that use completely separate communication systems. Perfect timing suggested advanced knowledge of meetings and communications rather than detection through surveillance. The targeting required access to compartmented information available only to a very limited number of CIA officers with special clearances. The pattern was simply too precise to be explained by improved Soviet counterintelligence methodology alone. Counterintelligence officers began systematically constructing a profile of the potential compromiser using analytical methods developed over decades of spy catching. The person would need direct operational access to Soviet operations files and databases. They required detailed knowledge of asset identities beyond what appeared in summary reports. They needed visibility into Moscow station reporting and operational cables. They would likely hold a position in the Soviet East European Division of the Directorate of Operations, with years of experience and established trust within the organization's hierarchy. The pool of potential suspects was actually quite small when these criteria were applied systematically. Only a few officers knew all of the compromised identities across different operational compartments. Aldrich Ames was prominently among them. The formation of the joint CIA-FBI task force in January of 1991 marked a critical turning point in the investigation that would eventually identify Ames. Previous counterintelligence efforts had focused primarily on technical explanations for the operational losses or external threats from improved Soviet surveillance. The new approach centered on a systematic analysis of internal personnel with access to compromised information, applying rigorous statistical methods and financial analysis to identify anomalies that previous investigations had missed. The joint structure represented a significant shift in how American intelligence agencies approached insider threat investigations. FBI Washington Field Office personnel brought specialized expertise in domestic counterintelligence investigations that complemented CIA capabilities. They understood financial forensics and banking analysis that could trace money flows and identify unexplained wealth. They possessed surveillance techniques refined through years of criminal investigations and espionage cases. They knew the legal requirements for building criminal cases that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. The CIA contributed operational knowledge about intelligence tradecraft and hostile intelligence services, access to classified records that documented the compromised operations, and deep understanding of how espionage operations functioned in practice. The joint structure allowed cross-agency data analysis that had been difficult to coordinate previously due to bureaucratic barriers and classification restrictions. Initial analysis of financial records revealed patterns far outside Ames's documented salary range, creating the first substantial break in the investigation. His official income remained under $70,000 annually throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, consistent with government pay scales for his position and experience level. Yet his spending and asset accumulation suggested total income several times higher, at a level consistent with substantial external payments. The discrepancy became more pronounced over time as the KGB payments continued year after year, and Ames made increasingly large purchases that couldn't be explained by legitimate income sources. CIA leadership initially resisted the implication that a senior officer with Ames's service record might be responsible for the catastrophic losses. The institutional culture maintained strong assumptions that officers who had served for decades were highly unlikely espionage risks. They had passed security reviews repeatedly throughout their careers. They held positions of significant trust and responsibility. This assumption proved to be a critical vulnerability in the agency's security posture, creating a dangerous blind spot that allowed Ames to operate undetected for years despite warning signs that should have triggered investigation. Statistical analysis conducted by the Joint Task Force demonstrated patterns that matched human source betrayal rather than technical surveillance or external compromise of communications systems. The timing of asset losses correlated precisely with Ames's access to specific operational information with statistical significance that couldn't be coincidental. Operations he knew about through his official duties were systematically compromised. Operations that were carefully compartmented away from him continued successfully without Soviet interference. This correlation became increasingly difficult to explain through any hypothesis except direct, deliberate betrayal by someone with Ames's specific access profile. CIA analysts Sandy Grimes and Jean Vertefeuille led much of the detailed internal investigation that proved crucial to identifying Ames. They methodically reviewed operational records spanning years of CIA activities. They constructed precise timelines of asset compromises showing exactly when each loss occurred. They identified the complete pool of CIA personnel with requisite access to all compromised operations. The analysis narrowed systematically to a small group of officers who had the necessary access and opportunity, then focused increasingly on Ames as statistical anomalies accumulated and financial evidence strengthened. Surveillance technology played a crucial role in gathering evidence that would eventually support prosecution. Vehicular surveillance grids tracked Ames's movements throughout the Washington metropolitan area, with multiple teams providing continuous coverage. Photographic equipment documented his meetings and contacts with suspected Russian intelligence officers, as referenced in FBI technical documentation. Teams coordinated across multiple locations simultaneously, building a comprehensive picture of his activities over months of intensive observation. The surveillance operation required substantial resources and careful coordination to avoid detection by Ames or his Russian handlers. Travel logs provided additional corroborating evidence that strengthened the case against Ames. Records showed his foreign travel synchronized suspiciously with Soviet embassy contacts in the countries he visited on official business. Communications intercepts, carefully analyzed for patterns and content, revealed references that investigators believed related directly to Ames's espionage activities. The evidence accumulated gradually, piece by piece, until the case became overwhelming. An intercepted communication referenced a trusted source within the enemy headquarters, language that aligned perfectly with KGB descriptions of high-value penetrations of Western intelligence services. Throughout 1992, FBI surveillance teams intensified their observation of Ames's activities as evidence accumulated and the case moved toward prosecution. The investigation required extremely careful operational balance between competing objectives. Teams needed to gather evidence sufficient for criminal prosecution that would convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. They had to avoid any actions that might alert Ames to the surveillance and cause him to alter his behavior. If he suspected investigation, he might immediately cease espionage activities, destroying valuable evidence. He could alert his Russian handlers that his cover was compromised. He might even attempt to flee the country to avoid arrest and prosecution. In 1992, surveillance teams recorded Ames delivering a briefcase to Russian intelligence handlers in a meeting that provided crucial direct evidence. The observation occurred in Washington, documented through long-range photographic surveillance and coordinated observation by multiple teams positioned to cover all angles. The briefcase delivery represented exactly the kind of direct evidence investigators needed to prove active espionage rather than historical acts. It showed physical transfer of materials to foreign intelligence officers in a manner inconsistent with any legitimate explanation. The surveillance documentation would become a centerpiece of the prosecution case. Senior CIA officers had traditionally been presumed to be highly unlikely espionage risks based on their accumulated years of faithful service. Their established careers and positions of significant responsibility within the intelligence community supported this presumption. This institutional assumption created the organizational blind spot that had allowed Ames to operate undetected for years despite warning signs that appeared repeatedly in his financial profile. Once surveillance confirmed active, ongoing espionage rather than historical compromise, however, the presumption shattered completely. The evidence demonstrated conclusively that tenure and position provided absolutely no immunity from betrayal or guarantee of continued loyalty. Forensic analysis of recovered documents confirmed the investigation's worst fears about the scope and severity of Ames's betrayal. Materials that Ames delivered to Russian intelligence handlers contained highly restricted operational cables describing ongoing CIA operations. They included classified reports from Moscow Station, revealing intelligence sources and methods. They contained asset identification information that could be used to target specific individuals for arrest. The documents matched precisely with Ames's classified handling logs maintained by CIA security systems, establishing direct, irrefutable links between information he accessed in his official capacity and intelligence delivered to Russian intelligence services. Technology employed in the final evidence consolidation phase included sophisticated surveillance equipment that had been developed specifically for counterintelligence operations. Parabolic microphone arrays allowed distant audio surveillance of conversations that would have been impossible to monitor through conventional methods, as referenced in FBI technical documentation from the period. Long-range photographic systems documented meetings and materials transfers from hundreds of meters away without alerting subjects to observation. These technical capabilities, combined with traditional surveillance methods refined over decades of FBI experience, built a comprehensive evidentiary record that would prove decisive in court. Forensic review teams worked systematically to match Ames's classified document handling logs against the operational compromises recorded in detailed CIA loss reports. The correlation proved statistically overwhelming when analyzed rigorously. Operations that Ames knew about through his official duties were systematically compromised by Soviet counterintelligence. Operations that were carefully compartmented from his access remained secure and continued producing intelligence. The timing of his access to specific operational information consistently preceded compromises by days or weeks, establishing clear causation rather than mere correlation. No alternative explanation could account for the precision of the pattern. By late 1993, investigators had compiled sufficient evidence to support arrest and criminal prosecution in federal court. The case file included comprehensive financial records documenting unexplained income totaling millions of dollars. It contained detailed surveillance documentation of direct contact with Russian intelligence officers on multiple occasions. Forensic analysis of delivered documents linked them definitively to CIA classified materials. Statistical correlation between Ames's access and operational compromises demonstrated the pattern of betrayal. The evidence was comprehensive and compelling by any prosecutorial standard. Investigators prepared carefully for the final operational move that would end Ames's espionage career and begin the comprehensive damage assessment process. February of 1994 brought the investigation to its operational conclusion after years of patient intelligence work. Ames continued his daily routine with no apparent awareness that his activities were under constant observation. He commuted from his comfortable Arlington home to CIA headquarters at Langley, maintaining his cover as a loyal intelligence officer. From all observable behavior, Ames continued his routine as if unaware that months of intensive, full-spectrum surveillance coverage had meticulously documented his every movement, contact, and financial transaction. The surveillance teams had compiled hundreds of hours of observation, building an airtight case for prosecution that would be presented to a federal grand jury. Available evidence indicates that Russian intelligence services had no indication that U.S. authorities had identified Ames or that arrest was imminent. From their operational perspective, their most valuable American asset continued to provide high-level intelligence about CIA operations with no signs of compromise. He reported regularly on CIA counterintelligence efforts that might threaten Russian operations. He provided updates on internal security reviews that could affect his continued access. He delivered intelligence about ongoing operations targeting Russian interests. From the available record, there is no sign that his handlers suspected an imminent arrest. The Russian services believed they were operating from a position of continued success. The reality reflected months of meticulous preparation by American counterintelligence professionals. FBI and CIA teams working in close coordination had tracked every contact Ames made with Russian intelligence officers. They documented every financial transaction he conducted, tracing the money flows through multiple accounts. They recorded every movement he made throughout the Washington metropolitan area using coordinated surveillance grids. Surveillance logs compiled for the arrest warrant documented hundreds of hours of observation across multiple months. They captured meetings, communications, and financial transactions. They built a comprehensive case for prosecution that would withstand the most rigorous courtroom scrutiny and leave no reasonable doubt about Ames's guilt. The arrest timing required careful coordination among multiple agencies and careful consideration of operational security. Authorities needed to ensure Ames was alone and accessible to arrest teams when they moved. He had to be unable to destroy evidence that remained in his home and office. He needed to be prevented from alerting his Russian handlers that his cover had been compromised. The morning of February 21st provided the optimal operational window based on careful analysis of his patterns. Ames would be leaving his home in his regular morning routine. before reaching CIA headquarters, where his arrest might compromise ongoing operations or alert other potential Russian assets. Once Ames crossed from Fairfax County into Arlington, the arrest protocol could be executed safely without jurisdictional complications that might create legal problems for the prosecution. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning on February 21st, 1994, FBI arrest teams moved decisively into position around Ames's silver Jaguar XJ6 as he drove toward CIA headquarters. Multiple unmarked vehicles blocked his route simultaneously from different directions, preventing any possibility of escape. Agents approached the vehicle with weapons drawn, executing arrest procedures that had been carefully developed for potentially dangerous suspects who might resist. The tactical operation proceeded exactly according to the detailed plan that had been rehearsed multiple times to ensure flawless execution. The CIA had anticipated minimal physical resistance based on Ames's psychological profile and comprehensive behavioral assessment. He was not trained in combat operations or tactical skills. He had no documented history of violence in his personal or professional life. He faced overwhelming tactical superiority in the highly trained arrest team surrounding him. The assessment proved accurate in every respect. When armed agents ordered him from the vehicle with weapons trained on him, Ames cooperated without any resistance. He made no attempt to flee or destroy evidence. He offered no physical opposition to the arrest. He provided no immediate explanation for the evidence agents knew they would find in multiple locations. The Jaguar he was driving, his Arlington home, and his CIA office all contained materials that would conclusively confirm the espionage charges. Standard FBI evidence collection protocols, meticulously documented on Form FD 597 according to established procedures, ensured that all seized materials maintained proper chain of custody for eventual presentation in court. Every item was photographed, catalogued, and secured according to strict procedures that would withstand defense scrutiny. Evidence teams worked methodically and systematically through Ames's possessions over several hours of detailed searching. They recovered handwritten notes detailing his contacts with Russian intelligence officers, including dates, locations, and subjects discussed. They found Soviet payment logs that documented the $2.5 million he had received over nearly a decade of espionage. They discovered classified identifiers for CIA assets operating in Moscow that should never have left secure facilities. The physical evidence, combined with extensive surveillance documentation and comprehensive financial records, built a case that left absolutely no reasonable doubt about Ames's guilt. The evidence presented in court was overwhelming, leaving little room for any alternative explanation. Additional evidence found in Ames's home during the thorough search included communications he had received from his KGB handlers, providing instructions and responding to his intelligence reports. Classified documents that had been improperly removed from CIA facilities were recovered from his personal files. Materials used for signaling meetings with Russian handlers were documented and seized. Each item represented a separate, serious security violation. Collectively, they demonstrated years of systematic, deliberate betrayal of the United States and of the CIA officers and assets whose lives depended on operational security. The full scope of damage Ames had inflicted still required a formal, comprehensive assessment by CIA analytical teams. The damage assessment process began immediately after Ames's arrest, with the full resources of the CIA devoted to understanding the scope of the compromise. CIA analytical teams at Langley conducted a comprehensive loss inventory that would take months to complete. They systematically reviewed every operation, asset, and intelligence channel that Ames had accessed during his espionage career, spanning nearly a decade. The process required months of painstaking, detailed analysis involving hundreds of intelligence professionals. Teams compared operational records against what Ames knew at specific times through his official duties. They traced exactly what information he could have provided to Russian intelligence and when he had that access. The initial expectation suggested that several important assets had been lost, consistent with the Moscow arrests observed in 1985 and subsequent compromises that had been documented. As the assessment progressed systematically through operational files, however, the full scale of devastation became horrifyingly clear to investigators. The final count confirmed 27 compromised operations spanning nearly every aspect of CIA collection against Soviet targets. Multiple valuable assets had been arrested and executed by Soviet authorities. Entire intelligence networks painstakingly built over years were rendered completely ineffective. The losses represented decades of operational investment and intelligence capability. Several of the compromised assets were executed by Soviet authorities after arrest, trial, and conviction for espionage. Valery Martinov, the KGB officer who had provided valuable intelligence about Soviet operations in Washington, was arrested, tried in secret proceedings, and executed. Sergei Motorin, another KGB officer who had been working productively for the CIA, met the same fate. Adolf Tolkachev, a Soviet electronics engineer who had provided extraordinary intelligence about USSR military aviation systems, was also arrested and executed directly based on information Ames provided to his KGB handlers. These were not just intelligence losses, but personal betrayals of courageous individuals who had risked everything to provide information to the United States. The executions represented not just intelligence losses that could be measured in operational terms, but profound personal betrayals of individuals who had trusted the CIA to protect their identities. These were real people, with families and futures who died because a CIA officer chose money over honor. CIA officers who had personally handled these brave assets faced the terrible knowledge that their sources had been deliberately compromised by a trusted colleague. This led directly to their arrests, show trials, and executions. The psychological impact on CIA personnel was devastating and long-lasting. Beyond the human losses that could never be recovered, the compromises destroyed intelligence capabilities the CIA had spent literally decades developing through patient, dangerous work. Communications networks that had been carefully established became ineffective once the KGB understood how they functioned. Operational methods that had worked successfully for years were compromised and had to be completely abandoned. Recruitment approaches that had been refined through experience failed once the KGB knew exactly what to look for. The agency faced the daunting task of rebuilding Soviet operations essentially from zero, operating under the reasonable assumption that the KGB knew everything Ames had revealed about CIA methods and capabilities. CIA analytical models processed the historical data methodically, attempting to quantify the intelligence losses in systematic, measurable terms. The models confirmed what analysts understood qualitatively through operational experience. The Ames compromise represented one of the single most damaging intelligence failures in CIA history, according to the agency's own assessment. It exceeded even the losses from previous serious spy cases in both scope and strategic impact. The damage would take years to repair. The CIA Inspector General's comprehensive report concluded that Ames's espionage constituted one of the most serious intelligence failures in U.S. history, according to the 1994 assessment. This stark conclusion appeared in official documentation, congressional testimony, and internal CIA reviews. The agency now faced the absolute necessity of completely rebuilding its internal security protocols to prevent future compromises of similar magnitude. The CIA now had to rebuild its internal security protocols from first principles, assuming that existing systems had failed catastrophically. The institutional response to Ames's betrayal centered on comprehensive, fundamental reforms to internal security procedures across the entire intelligence community. Congressional hearings throughout 1995 demanded systematic oversight improvements with much greater rigor than had existed previously. Legislators expressed outrage that such a devastating compromise had been allowed to continue for nearly a decade despite warning signs. The CIA implemented substantial changes to its counterintelligence architecture in response to both internal reviews and external congressional pressure. The reforms represented the most significant changes to CIA security procedures since the agency's founding. Initial expectations among some CIA officials suggested that limited reforms addressing specific vulnerabilities Ames had exploited would be sufficient. The congressional and broader intelligence community response proved far more comprehensive and demanding than agency leadership had anticipated. Financial tracking systems were completely overhauled, with automated monitoring capabilities replacing ineffective manual reviews. Computer systems now flagged statistical anomalies automatically for investigation. Polygraph examination frequency increased substantially, particularly for officers with access to sensitive human intelligence operations involving sources whose lives depended on security. Background reinvestigations became significantly more thorough and more frequent than before. They occurred every 5 years, rather than the longer intervals that had been standard practice. The CIA also implemented rotational assignment policies specifically designed to limit how long any single officer maintained access to sensitive compartmented information about ongoing operations. This rotation principle reduced the window of vulnerability during which a compromised officer could damage operations through continued access. While rotation created some operational complications and continuity problems, the security benefits were judged to outweigh the operational costs. Experienced officers had to move away from areas where they had developed deep expertise and productive source relationships, but the security trade-off was accepted as necessary. Personnel security divisions received dramatically increased resources and expanded authority to investigate potential security violations. The Office of Security gained substantially more personnel for investigative work, better technology for monitoring and analysis, and much clearer mandate to aggressively investigate anomalies even among senior officers with long service records. The cultural assumption that long-serving officers were inherently trustworthy had protected Ames for years despite warning signs. This dangerous assumption was systematically dismantled throughout the organization. The 1995 Congressional Review documented these procedural changes in extensive detail, creating a comprehensive public record of reforms. The review established baseline standards for intelligence community counterintelligence that extended beyond just the CIA. The review also identified continuing vulnerabilities in existing systems and recommended additional measures for implementation. Some recommendations faced initial resistance from operational elements concerned about negative mission impact, but most were eventually implemented. Ames's case became the definitive benchmark for counterintelligence reform throughout the U.S. intelligence community, influencing policies not just at CIA but across all agencies handling classified information. The long-term legacy of Aldrich Ames's espionage extends far beyond the immediate operational losses and structural reform implementations that followed his arrest. CIA retrospectives compiled in the years following his conviction consistently cite Ames as the clearest, most devastating example of insider threat vulnerability facing intelligence services. The case appears prominently in training programs across the intelligence community and in security briefings designed to illustrate how systemic failures enable catastrophic compromises. New CIA officers learn about the Ames case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency and the critical importance of vigilant security practices. The expectation following the Cold War's end in 1991 suggested that espionage intensity would naturally decline as ideological conflicts diminished and the Soviet Union dissolved. Many hoped that the new era would bring reduced intelligence competition and greater cooperation. This optimistic expectation proved completely mistaken in practice. Post-Cold War intelligence operations continued with undiminished intensity, though the specific targets and methods evolved with changing geopolitical circumstances. Russian intelligence services, the direct successor organizations to the KGB, maintained robust espionage programs against the United States despite improved diplomatic relations. Other nations expanded their intelligence collection efforts as geopolitical competition continued in new forms. Ames's case serves as a recurring reference point in academic analyses of intelligence failures published in scholarly journals. Studies examine counterintelligence methodology and organizational security culture with Ames as the primary case study. Research explores how the CIA's institutional assumptions about trusted insiders created exploitable vulnerabilities in security systems. Analysis shows how financial monitoring gaps enabled years of undetected espionage, despite obvious warning signs. Studies document how interagency coordination failures delayed identification of the compromise by years. The scholarly literature treats Ames as a watershed moment in counterintelligence history. CIA director statements in the years following Ames's arrest acknowledged publicly the systemic nature of the failure rather than blaming individual officers. The problem extended well beyond one officer's betrayal to encompass institutional practices that had evolved over decades. Cultural assumptions about trusted personnel had created dangerous blind spots. Procedural gaps had allowed obvious anomalies to go uninvestigated. Addressing these deeper issues required sustained effort, extending well beyond immediate reforms. It meant fundamentally embedding counterintelligence awareness throughout the organization's operational culture at every level. The damage to U.S.-Russian relations, complicated by the Ames case, persisted through the post-Cold War period despite diplomatic efforts. While both nations cooperated productively on certain issues like non-proliferation and counterterrorism, the betrayal reinforced deep mutual suspicions that had existed throughout the Cold War. It demonstrated conclusively that intelligence competition would continue unabated, regardless of broader diplomatic developments or formal agreements. The case directly influenced U.S. policy toward Russian intelligence activities for years. It justified continued counterintelligence vigilance and substantial resource allocation to protecting American secrets. The CIA Inspector General's 1994 assessment provided the definitive official judgment that shaped all subsequent analysis. The report stated directly that Ames's espionage represents a failure of institutional vigilance, compounded by procedural gaps that endangered national security. This conclusion appeared in declassified portions of the report released to Congress and eventually to the public. It established a formal public record of accountability while carefully protecting classified operational details that could not be revealed. The Ames case remains operationally relevant decades after his arrest and imprisonment. Intelligence services worldwide study the compromise as a comprehensive case study in insider threat detection and prevention. They examine systematically how organizations can detect and prevent similar betrayals before catastrophic damage occurs. The lessons extend well beyond intelligence agencies to any organization handling sensitive information, classified material, or trusted insiders with access to critical assets. Corporate security, military organizations, and government agencies all study the Ames case. For the CIA specifically, Ames represents an enduring reminder that internal security requires constant, active vigilance rather than passive compliance. It demands systematic procedures applied rigorously without exception and willingness to investigate even the most trusted personnel when evidence suggests potential compromise. The assumption that long service and established trust provide immunity from betrayal proved catastrophically wrong. The corrective measures implemented after Ames's arrest reflect hard-won understanding that effective security depends fundamentally on verification through multiple independent methods, not trust alone. The 27 compromised operations, the executed assets, and the operational disruption constitute the measurable costs of Ames's betrayal that can be documented. According to post-1995 congressional and government assessments, Ames's actions cost the U.S. billions in lost intelligence capability. The broader costs severely damaged credibility with liaison services, reduced operational effectiveness across multiple theaters, and persistent organizational trauma affecting an entire generation of intelligence officers. Resist precise quantification, but fundamentally shaped the CIA's evolution through the post-Cold War decades. For more fact-based Cold War investigations, you're welcome to subscribe and add your insights in the comments.